This story happened to me over 20 years ago, back in the summer of 1992. It was the summer between my first and second year of college, and I was working that summer on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. My father worked for the Park Service at the time and could pull some strings and get my siblings and I jobs working in restaurants at national parks around the country. That summer, I went to work at the Bright Angel Lodge on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. First, some backstory as to what was going on in Arizona at the time. From 1990 to 1991, a man named Danny Ray Horning went on a bank robbing spree across the western United States that ended up with him getting arrested in Arizona in 1991. He was basically given a life sentence and put in prison near Phoenix, Arizona. He was also wanted in California for murder, but since he had basically a life sentence in Arizona, they decided not to extradite him there. In 1992, Horning put on a doctor's coat he found at the prison and basically walked right out of it. He then proceeded to disappear with authorities having no idea where he went. The first reported sighting of him was when he kidnapped a couple in Flagstaff, Arizona, and they drove to the Grand Canyon. After arriving in the Grand Canyon, Danny Ray tried to kidnap a family, and that went wrong and he ended up getting into a high-speed chase and shootout with the Park Service police before ditching the car and fleeing into the woods. Danny had been in the military and had received survival training, so he knew how to survive off of the land. At any rate, he eluded the police for the next month and a half by hiding out in the surrounding forest. Some 400 state and federal agents descended on the area to search for him. This made life interesting while living in the park. Helicopters would fly over the forest looking for him, and agents would patrol the area with assault rifles and canines. If you wanted to leave the park, you usually had to go through 3 police checkpoints. At one point, he was spotted in the area of my employee dorm, so they brought police with canines to search each room. The restaurant that I worked at had a huge kitchen and a long hallway on one end leading out the back. At the back of the hallway were the walk-in coolers. With my hours, I would get off work at 2:30 a.m., and at this time, there would only be 2 other dishwashers and myself as well, as another man who would come in to start prepping for breakfast. The kitchen was massive, and there was hardly anywhere to notice if anyone else walked in the back hallway. The manager and cooks noticed some things were missing from the walk-in coolers at one point, and they checked surveillance video and saw someone who appeared to be Danny Ray sneaking in and going into one of the walk-in coolers and getting food and then leaving. Even with all of this going on, I just kind of kept about my business and didn't really think I would have a run-in with him or anything. I also didn't really have access to a TV or read the papers much, so I didn't know much about what was going on with the whole situation, other than by word of mouth. In these jobs, you would usually start out working in the kitchen as a dishwasher, or in the restaurant as a busser. I started out as a dishwasher and worked the evening shift starting at 6 p.m. and ended at 2:30 a.m. When I would get off work at 2:30, I would have to walk back to the employee housing because the public shuttle had stopped running hours before. The employee housing was about 2 miles from the restaurant, and I had 2 options on how I could walk there. The first was to walk along the main road through the park that took you past the visitor center and then by the general store. It wasn't very pretty as it was just a dirt path, basically alongside the road, but it was a bit safer as it was patrolled by park rangers. The second option was to walk along the Grand Canyon Rim Trail for about a mile before connecting up with another trail that would take you up through the woods and dump you out at the visitor center along the main road. This option was much prettier, as you would walk along the edge of the Grand Canyon in the forest, but it was also somewhat scary because it was pitch black out with no light unless the moon was out. I liked to walk this route because it was so beautiful with the stars looking so bright, and also the big empty black void of the canyon right next to you. Going this way also made me nervous because I had heard about there being mountain lions in the park, and also who knows what kind of person I might run into out for a late night stroll along the canyon. That night, I decided to walk along the rim trail, as I had my flashlight with me. I made it along the rim trail without incident, and connected with the trail that cuts over to the visitor center. The trail is a little scary, as it cuts through pretty thick woods for about half a mile before arriving at the visitor center. This trail is usually pitch black at this time of night, with not even moonlight penetrating through the thick trees. I walked the trail until I was almost at the visitor center, and remembered that behind the visitor center is an amphitheater, and I had never seen it before, so I wanted to go to it to see what it looked like, even though it was now about 3 a.m. and pitch black out. The amphitheater is a short walk through the woods before you arrive at it. I walked over to it and walked around it and up onto the stage, and the whole time shining my flashlight around to get a look at it. It's kind of a crude amphitheater with just basically an elevated platform surrounded by benches, and with the forest surrounding the whole thing. I was shining my flashlights around the area, when suddenly I hear rustling in the surrounding trees. I get a little nervous knowing that it's not the wind, as there is no wind that night, and think that it might be an animal or something. I hear it again, so I shine my flashlight out into the forest to see if I see anything. I stepped off the stage and I walk in the direction that I heard it coming from, while shining my flashlight around through the trees. At this point, I was past all the benches of the amphitheater and entering the surrounding forest. I hear the rustling again. It was getting louder, so I knew I was getting closer to it. Now, I grew up in the mountains of Colorado and have come across animals in the woods before. When they make noise, it is usually pretty constant, such as when they are moving around and you might hear twigs breaking or such, but this time, I wasn't hearing that. These were much more controlled, rustling noises that would happen every couple of minutes. I keep walking further into the forest and shining my flashlight, when suddenly, I briefly see something shining through the trees. I walk towards it and get closer to it, and I see what looks like a large bag laying on the forest floor. I keep walking towards it, and all of a sudden, see it rustle as if something is inside or underneath it. Finally, I'm only about 5 or 6 feet from it. I see that it is several feet long and shiny on the outside. I keep my flashlight on it, and at this point, I'm just inching towards it. I have to know what's inside of it. All of a sudden, the bag rolls towards me, and a face pops out of it. I shine my flashlight in the face for a second, and it's at this point that I realize that it's someone sleeping out here in the woods, wrapped up in a blanket, and what looks like a thermal blanket on top of it. They must just be camping out here. The face is of a man, and he has reddish blonde hair and a mustache. His eyes are still closed, so it looks like he's sleeping. Behind the bag, I see a backpack. I quickly shut off my flashlight so as to not wake him if he's sleeping, and start slowly backing up. I get all the way back to the trail, continuing to hear the rustling occasionally the whole time. And then I walk the main trail up past the visitor center, and eventually get back to the housing without incident, but somewhat spooked the whole time and constantly checking to make sure that I'm not being followed. I was somewhat spooked by this the next couple of days, but then I realized that it wasn't that unusual to see people sleeping in their cars or campers in the parking lots, or maybe even out in the woods in a tent, though it is against the park rules, because they would arrive late at the park or just didn't want to pay the high hotel rates. What did strike me as weird was that when I had seen people camping before, they were usually close to their car and would have a tent or other gear with them. This situation seemed weird because this guy had only had his backpack and just looked like a blanket is all. Also, the nearest parking lot was at the visitor center, and I didn't see any cars there that night. At any rate, I just kind of shrugged it off. I even walked by the spot the next day and didn't see anything or any evidence that he was there. This happened just a few days after it was made official that Danny Ray Horning had entered the park, but I hadn't seen what he looked like yet. This was also long before the park became overran with authorities searching for him. And then one day I happened to see a wanted picture of him, and was shocked to see that he had blonde hair and a mustache. The wanted notice also said that he was last seen with reddish blonde hair after recently dyeing it. I'm pretty certain that that was the man that I saw that night. Maybe he was asleep. Maybe he was just pretending to be. I'll never know. even though he never hurt any civilians during his escape. He did kidnap several to use as hostages, so who knows what he would have done. At any rate, he was eventually caught after he kidnapped 2 women and forced them to drive out of the park. He managed to drive through 2 police roadblocks after the police failed to recognize him and wave them on. He then tied the woman to a tree near Sedona and fled in their car. The woman escaped and called police, who then spotted the car, and another high-speed chase and shootout happened before he fled again into the woods. The next morning, a man spotted him in his backyard, drinking from his hose, and called the police, who searched the area but couldn't find him. The next morning, a policeman went back to that house to research it, and found him sleeping under their gazebo and arrested him. He was also extradited back to California, and tried for the earlier murder, and today he is currently sitting on death row in San Quentin prison. My husband and I live not too far from a state park that we've been going to lately for walks in the afternoon. Yesterday was a really awesome day. The weather was perfect and we felt great about getting our walk in. We're trying to lose some weight. The park is pretty spread out, so by the time we get halfway through, we're pretty far from our vehicle. We're laughing and having a good time when a car pulls alongside us and just stares at the stroller that I'm pushing with my newborn son inside. My husband and I think it's super creepy and move along quickly, and the car makes leave. We get across this bridge to another parking lot to discover the same car is parked by the trail that we were taking. When we get somewhat close, 2 guys with little dogs get out and go in separate directions, and one sits in the driver's seat with the car running. We don't like this, but also know that we tend to be pretty paranoid. My husband is 6'5" and huge. Who would willingly mess with him? The car stays put, much to our relief, and we make it to the end in about an hour. All is fine and dandy until we come back through and find the same car. It's a different parking lot. The 2 guys are out again walking their tiny dogs. These guys are about late 40s to early 50s, look pretty rough and are staring directly at us. They jump in the car and they head our way. And by this time, we're super paranoid. I grab my husband and we sit at a conveniently placed picnic table that is right off the road to wait them out. They just sit there at the stop sign facing us for about 2 minutes, until another car comes and forces them to move. Those 2 minutes felt like hours. We book it out of there with a death grip on the stroller. We get back over the bridge and guess who was sitting there? Yep, the same guys. We keep walking like we didn't notice, and my husband gets the license plate number, the make and the model of the car. And my husband has had enough now. We make it to the store restaurant that is halfway through the park and go inside and call the police. I sit out front because my son is all fussy and I don't want him bothering anyone. My husband was only gone for a moment to grab an employee, maybe a minute, and I was in clear view. The people wouldn't even have had time to get to us. Anyway, cell reception is pretty much non-existent there. So my husband goes back inside and 2 of the employees, they were really nice, came out to sit with me. The creepers, all 3 this time, got out with their dogs and started walking around while keeping their distance, but still within eyeshot of me. The sheriff says to wait there, so we sit out front with one of the employees, watching the creepers watch us. I think they got nervous with everyone around, so they drove across the road to another building there. They parked to where their car was facing directly at us. After about 30 minutes or so, the sheriff pulls in and they zoom out there as fast as they can. One of the employees comes out to talk to the sheriff and say that he was watching the car from inside the store, and one of the guys were standing behind their car watching us the whole time. We just couldn't see him from where we were. The sheriff takes off looking for them, but I doubt he found them because that place is amazing. They went out the back way. In a way, I'm happy this happened to us instead of someone less paranoid. I have family members that take their kids up there all the time. I highly doubt that they would even notice someone following them. This whole ordeal lasted around 2 to 2.5 hours. I was so relieved to get my baby boy home. Things could have gone an entirely different way today. What started out as a simple walk on a nice day turned into a stalking and could have ended so badly. My husband and I thanked the sheriff and the store's employees profusely. I hate to think about what could have happened had they not been there or been so kind. The world is a crazy place. Be safe out there and keep your children, family, and friends close. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mountain Ray International Park. It technically wasn't an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up and I hear something open my tent, and there's a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular looking dude, just sitting there a couple feet from my tent. No bag or pack or anything on him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent. His eyes got huge like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence, and a guy that was probably high on something, and did somehow manage to set up a camp coincidentally not far from mine. And then 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in a totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night, and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness, someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away!" And kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person, I did. After like 15 minutes of me being very freaked out, and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days, because there is no way he could have accidentally wound up in the same spot, as vast as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but I didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so I stopped quickly after probably only 100 or 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I decided that the trip was very over first thing in the morning, and I hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following me off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things that I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises, at first in the distance, but slowly decided it sounded more like a human making animal calls. It could have actually been an animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again. It really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally get back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, it's probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation, but I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days it was.